pleasure to welcome you to today's event, which is entitled, Can It Happen Here? Law and Disorder, Executive Power, and Deploying Federal Officers. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize that today we are meeting on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Muckleshoot nations and other Coast Salish peoples, who call the waters and the coastline of the Salish Sea home. Since today's topic will touch on the Black Lives Matter protest, it is even more important to acknowledge the fact that Black and Indigenous people of color have been leading the resistance against white supremacy for many years, and that their perspectives should be centered when we talk about their history. I'd also like to remind you that today's event will be recorded. Please send any questions that come into your mind via the chat function to Alexandra Colley. And I wanted to mention at the outset that I'm exceedingly grateful to Alexandra for her help in organizing today's panel. I'm delighted today that we have a panel of 3 UW faculty to discuss the legal, historical, and political context surrounding this pivotal moment in history and the upcoming election and post-election period. Our conversation will center on the recent deployment of federal officers to the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement protests in cities around the United States. And we will also focus on the legal boundaries of executive power in the prelude up to and the aftermath of the November presidential election, putting these events in comparative historical perspective. Our panelists today are Lisa Manheim, Charles I. Stone Associate Professor of Law, Margaret O'Mara, Howard and Frances Keller Endowed Professor of History, and Laurie Marhoefer, Associate Professor of History. Very unfortunately, Professor Christopher Parker, Professor of Political Science, can't be with us today because of a last-minute conflict, but I encourage you to read his recent piece in the Washington Post, How Reckless White Allies Could Lead to the Re-Election of Trump, which was published on October 10th. You can find this piece and other suggested reading by our panelists on UW Today at the notice for the event and also on the History Department website. It's a really great resource of writings by our panelists. So the format today will be this. Each panelist will give brief remarks, and then we'll proceed to a question and answer session. Some of you have submitted questions already. And again, you can send your questions to Alexandra Colley via the chat function. So I'd like to now turn things over to Professor Manheim.
Thanks. So as we head into the 2020 elections, a lot of people I know are wondering, what role does the president play? What powers does he have to affect the process and maybe even the result? For example, can the president postpone the election? Can the president decide all on his own to dismantle mail-in voting? Or consider the protests that Professor Young referred to. Can the president send federal agents into cities for the purposes of suppressing political dissent? As a legal matter, the answers to these questions are no, no, and no. But as any earnest lawyer will very earnestly insist on telling you, it's complicated. So one way of thinking about the relevant legal framework is this. There are basically 2 sets of hurdles for the president to overcome when he takes any sort of official action. First, the president has to be able to point to some sort of authority, specifically something in the Constitution or in a law that's passed by Congress that allows the president to take that action. So say, for example, the president wants to repeal Obamacare. Fine, but there needs to be something in the Constitution or in a law that was passed by Congress that allows the president to do that. And it turns out that there isn't. And so that's why we're all here in August 2020 and President Trump still has not been able to repeal Obamacare. This then leads you to the second set of hurdles. So even if a president can excuse me for a sec, even if a president can point to something in the Constitution or in one of Congress's laws that allows him to take an action, he can't take that action in a way that would violate other legal rules. For example, those contained in the First Amendment. So to take another recent example, let's talk about DACA for a second. If the president wants to repeal DACA, okay, and it turns out that he actually does have the legal authority to repeal this, at least through some people who work for him. However, the president can't repeal a policy like DACA in a way that violates other legal rules. For example, he can't violate this statute that Congress passed called the Administrative Procedure Act. And it's actually that act, and more specific, or sort of more generally, the second set of hurdles that helps to explain why, again, we're all here in August 2020, and the Trump administration has still not successfully been able to repeal DACA. It's because of this second set of hurdles. So, as a legal matter, when you have the president trying to take some sort of action, there are two sets of hurdles for him to overcome. First hurdle, does the Constitution or one of Congress's laws give the president the power to take this action? Second hurdle, even if the president does have this power, is he exercising it in a way that is consistent with all these other legal rules? So with these two sets of hurdles in mind, we can turn back to the three questions that we started with. So first, can the president postpone the election? No. There's nothing in the Constitution or in any law passed by Congress that allows the president to do this. He cannot get over that first hurdle. He can't do it. Second question, can the president unilaterally dismantle mail-in voting? Again, the answer is no. So when it comes to the voting part, the president has no direct power at all over how voters cast their ballots. He can't get over that first legal hurdle. But of course, when it comes to mail-in voting, there's also the mailing part. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated as a legal matter. The president has very little direct power over the operations at the US Postal Service. So for example, he can't just order USPS to stop delivering ballots. But he does have some indirect power over the Postal Service. For example, he can appoint some of the people who can then appoint the Postmaster General, who in turn can exercise a lot of control over the Postal Service. So in this sense, the president can act, but only at a couple of degrees removed. The president can also, of course, threaten to, or veto or threaten to veto congressional relief packages that seek to bail out USPS or otherwise affect the Postal Service in ways that the president doesn't like. So there are some things that the president can do, ways for the president to get over that first hurdle with respect to mail-in voting. But these actions are all very indirect, and there are also many other powerful actors involved. And just as a final point there, even if the president is able to change things by, through these indirect means, there's always a possibility that that second set of hurdles is going to come up and pose problems if the president's actions were to interfere too much with voting. So finally, as a legal matter, can the president send federal agents into cities for the purpose of suppressing political dissent? Once again, the answer is no, but again, it's complicated. So here, Congress has enacted a law, and for those of you who like legal citations and who does not, it's 40 U.S.C. 1315 that allows the head of DHS, that is the head of Homeland Security, to send armed federal agents in to protect federal property. And the president, in turn, has a lot of control over the head of Homeland Security, who he handpicks and then can fire at any time. So it's this section 1315, this congressional law, that the federal government has been citing as the legal basis for sending DHS agents into places like Portland. And based on this argument, they may in fact be able to get over that first hurdle. The law does, in some circumstance, allow the federal government to send federal agents into cities. But remember, that's just the first hurdle. Does the government have the power? And here, yeah, maybe they do. But that just brings us to the second question. Has the government exercised it in a way that's consistent with all the other rules that apply? And here, actually, the answer is, in many ways, probably not. If, for example, the president is sending federal agents into cities for the purpose of suppressing political dissent, that's unconstitutional. It violates the First Amendment. Same if the agents are arresting people on the streets without adequate cause, or if they're engaging in excessive force, or if they're arresting people without Miranda warnings. All of that is unconstitutional. So here, the president might be able to satisfy the first hurdle, but he quickly runs into a lot of problems with the second hurdle. Okay, so we just sort of talked about these three examples, which hopefully help to show you the basics of how the law works in this area. And for those of you, if you'd like to kind of get out of the weeds, the big overarching punchline is that the law really does allow the president a lot of power, and a lot of power with respect to issues that touch on elections and touch on federal agents and use of force. But the law also constrains the president in meaningful ways. So if I could take just one more minute, I was hoping to give one sort of giant set of caveats when it comes to these legal sort of issues that we're discussing. So we've been talking for a few minutes now about the law, but when we're tackling questions like this, it's not going to be enough to talk about just the law. And that's because, of course, you know, on the one hand, just because the president can do something, it doesn't mean he will do it. And on the other hand, just because a president cannot do something under the law doesn't mean necessarily that he won't do it. Rather, sometimes the president does things that the law doesn't allow, perhaps because the law is unclear and it's a genuine mistake, perhaps because the president knows it's illegal, but he's willing to pay the legal consequences, or perhaps because there aren't adequate enforcement mechanisms and the president just doesn't care that it's illegal. So given the possibility that the law won't always constrain a president, these legal frameworks provide a starting point, an important starting point, but only a starting point and not a complete explanation of what's going on. So to get a better sense for that, we really need to look beyond just law and start talking about politics and history, both in the United States as well and in other countries that have grappled with similar problems. So with that, I was hoping that we could turn to Professor O'Mara.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Manheim. That's amazing. I am going to talk about if legal scholars think things are complicated, then historians really do, as I know if any of the history majors or minors who are on this webinar know familiarly. But I'm going to share my screen here, just because I just have a few bits of some visual aids to walk us through some of these things I'm going to talk about. So the first thing is just to think about how history has contoured, you know, where this legal authority comes from and how it's evolved over time. And so if we go to Article 2 of the Constitution, which, you know, kind of establishes what the presidency is and what its powers are, you know, one of the things to remember is that this 1789, what the United States was. It was, as my asterisk kind of somewhat snarkily explains, is, you know, a small, struggling, fractious agricultural country without a standing military that had just overthrown a monarch, feared the return of autocracy, and that had been highly reluctant to embrace an executive in the first place. So the president's power is very much constrained. You know, he is the executive of things that Congress decides to do. And the executive branch itself was quite small. In fact, funnily enough, one of the largest pieces of the executive branch for a good chunk of the 19th century was the postal service itself, the post office. So funny that old things are new once again. So let's see where I always have a hard time advancing the first time. Okay, there we go. So, but this does not stay static. So I think the really important thing is to think about how the presidency is conceived of one thing. And of course it changes based on the inhabitants of the office and of the circumstances of the times. And so we have these moments of expansion, and I'm going to very kind of simply and quickly run through them, some high points. But for example, and I think one reason that, you know, if you can, you know, close your eyes and think about all of the presidents you remember from the 19th century, there are a few names that pop out: Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln. Not coincidentally, these are the same people who were presiding over an expansion of executive power. For example, the Civil War is at a moment in which the executive action has taken by Lincoln as a way to bind the Union, but also because he's able to do it because his Southern opposition has seceded not only from Congress but from the United States altogether, that Lincoln and the Republicans do take quite a few measures that significantly expand the growth of the national government, and with it the growth of the executive who's in charge of the executive branch. So that includes the Homestead Act of 1962, the Transcontinental Railroad Act of 1862, the Morrill Act, which establishes land-grant universities, and on, not to mention the amendments to the Constitution, the Reconstruction Amendments, and the subsequent occupation of the South after the Civil War by United States troops during Reconstruction, in which a military occupation was advancing the cause of civil rights and advancing and ensuring that the new amendments to the Constitution were being adhered to by the South. And then after 1877, when the U.S. troops go away, then the South cleaves into Jim Crow. Another big moment of expansion, and again, even after the 1860s and through the 19th and early 20th century, the national government is small, or much smaller than it is, and the presidency is significant, but again, not as big of a job as it becomes. It's really the 1930s and 40s, the New Deal and World War II, when this transforms. The government grows and presidential power grows with it. The power of the presidency as a kind of the leader of the country, as a great communicator, as someone who is seen as responsible for all sorts of dimensions of citizenship and human welfare that the president himself previously did not. The other really significant thing that happens in the middle part of the 20th century is the US becomes a military superpower, a nuclear superpower. And with that too, the power of the presidency grows. So we're talking about the troops, sending in the troops. And one of the things that is a significant, corollary to that is that the size of the military, a standing military, is something that's become a permanent feature of American life in a way that it was not before 1945. Or even before 1950. So here you see defense spending, a big jump during the Korean War, and it goes down from there, but nonetheless, it is a significant percentage of GDP, and it declines at the end of the Cold War and pops up a little more afterwards, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. In the 1950s and 60s, we do have multiple moments in which presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, send in the troops, send in the U.S. Army to enforce civil rights. So this becomes a lot of what we're talking about too is federalism. The question of what a president can do is also what rights do states have to control their own destiny. And that certainly was the case of when these notable incidents, here we are in Little Rock, Arkansas, 1957, in which a Southern governor, Orville Faubus, had sent in his troops to keep the integration from happening, and Eisenhower overrules him and brings in the military to ensure that these 9 Black students are able to attend what had before been an all-white school, and that Brown versus Board of Education was being adhered to. So fast forward to this century, you have after 9/11, you have after the Cold War, military spending goes down, but then it pops up again after 9/11, and you have a growth of a national security state that includes entirely new agencies, most notably the Department of Homeland Security. And this is a very, I think, to sort of build on what Lisa was saying, you have now this new authority that the notion of securing the homeland and, of course, protecting federal property is very much key to the inception of the Department of Homeland Security in the wake of 9/11 as part of the war on terrorism and the perceived threat of terrorist action, particularly on federally owned property. So the expansion of and again, the presidency itself is becoming more powerful as this national security apparatus controlled by the executive branch, and particularly much of it within the White House itself, is growing. And during the George W. Bush presidency, you have a further kind of expansion of what's considered an emergency in which troops can be sent in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. The U.S. Army, not only the Corps of Engineers, but other branches of the U.S. Army come in to help help a beleaguered and flooded New Orleans, to rescue people, to prevent disorder from breaking out, and this is a new sort of application, new new context in which troops are sent in. But states do push back, and about a year later, there is a kind of curtailing of this expansion of what the president can do to send in troops. But there's still this ambiguity, and the law is one thing, but how it is interpreted and how it responds to the political context is another. So I want to leave with just the thought of, to recognition that the presidency itself, the US presidency, is far more powerful than it was ever designed to be. And of course, the presidency, all these institutions should be dynamic. The Constitution has been amended, multiple times. These are designed to be flexible, dynamic institutions. Nonetheless, what we're grappling with now is we have a constitutional apparatus of kind of what a president can and cannot do that is not always consonant with what the presidency has become. And so the question before us now is it too powerful? Yes, there are many things that the president can do. No, there are many things that he or she cannot. But what is the balance of power, and how has that evolved over time in ways that the founders didn't conceive? So I'll leave it right there.
Thank you very much, Margaret. So I'd like to now turn things over to Laurie Marhoefer, Professor Marhoefer.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much. This is fascinating. So I'm a historian of Weimar and Nazi Germany. So I'm a little bit coming from a different perspective. Okay. So ever since the 2016 election, there have been a lot of talk about parallels between the rise of Hitler and what's going on in the United States. And a lot of people have been thinking about the Weimar Republic, which was the parliamentary democracy that Germany had before the Nazis came to power. And there's been a lot of talk of, I mean, in a lot of ways, like that parliamentary democracy and then that authoritarian regime are, when Americans think outside of American history, that's the one you think of. That's our image of what a dictatorship looks like, and it was a pretty horrific dictatorship. So even people who haven't studied German history necessarily know about the Reichstag fire in 1933, which was a pretext for Hitler taking some dictatorial power and arresting political opponents, and other events in the rise of the Nazi dictatorship. I think right now that we are better off. I agree with a lot of political scientists and historians who think that we're actually better off thinking about some other examples of authoritarian leaders to make sense of our current moment. So for example, Viktor Orban, Fujimori, an example, what is more common in the later 20th century and the 21st century is a slower creep to an authoritarianism that is not fascist. So a book that I have found really helpful and that I recommend to everybody is this one, How Democracies Die, a great overview of some of the political scientists on the thinking of political scientists on this and on possible parallels. But as you can see, there are 4 indicators of authoritarian behavior drawn from a number of examples in the 20th century around the world. Our current president meets all of these, right? Okay. Specifically, the question of using the police, using the military, or using a police-like force like federal agents against protesters is a red flag to people who study authoritarianism and study transitions between more democratic regimes to less democratic regimes. So Portland, for example, I also had a couple of sleepless nights around the Lafayette Square protests in Washington, D.C., and the threat, there were rumors of Trump considering the possibility of using federal troops against the peaceful protesters in D.C., and then there was that photo op in front of the church that everybody remembers, right? So some terrifying instances of the use of police or military police-like forces against protesters. People who study authoritarianism are worried in particular about 2 different paths that could feed off of such an instance. Okay, so one of them is in a transition between a democratic regime and an authoritarian regime, especially a quick transition like we saw in Germany when Hitler came to power. The support of usually the military is key, but there are also cases where authoritarian regimes have come in supported by police-like forces that were not the military, so supported by their own paramilitary. Initially, the Nazis have a somewhat tense relationship with the military, and they were able to win them over rather quickly. But you know, there's always the question of like, okay, so you think you're a dictator, who's got your back? And you need a significant armed force if there's going to be opposition in a transition from a democratic regime. Okay, so that's one thing that really comes up. But I think actually that those concerns, although I don't want to entirely dismiss them, are a little less germane to the situation than a second possible path, which is that so-called street violence and so-called law and order are really useful things for people who are authoritarian politicians to run on when they're still operating in a largely democratic system. So politicians who have authoritarian leanings, particularly when they are right of center people, are able to gain all kinds of political capital, particularly when they're playing on racism. So if you look back even to Trump's convention speech, when he, in 2016, in that speech, he really denigrated Black Lives Matter, and he portrayed Black Lives Matter as a chaotic, violent force in American streets, which was not the case. It's a really dark speech, and it was very effective. That kind of appeal to right of center people's fears about disorder, crime, right? All of that racialized, drawing on the very powerful legacy and still existing white racism in the United States. All of that is like a witch's brew that can be really, really, really helpful to people who are looking to curtail the democratic system. Okay. So unfortunately, Professor Christopher Parker couldn't be here today, but in thinking about this, which I think is something that we should right now, this problem of people who want to curtail the democratic system, portraying peaceful protesters as some kind of a threat to law and order, and thereby justifying the use of draconian measures or federal agents, for example, right? So thinking about this problem, in this piece that I think is a really, really useful one, Parker argues that particularly white allies should be really sensitive to how protests are being instrumentalized by Trump. And I think that that's important. I've also written on this in the context of Charlottesville. And here I do see a parallel to Weimar, but I think that people who support the democratic system have to be really sensitive about not playing into that narrative about violence in the streets. So, for example, I think that the Antifa's response after Charlottesville was really counterproductive. I thought it was very important to think about the optics of the protests and to really utilize nonviolent tactics rather than doing what the Antifa does, which is allowing that sometimes violence against Nazis is appropriate, which is not an outrageous idea, right? A lot of people feel very strongly about Nazis, but I think it's very important to think about, well, how is that going to play? Okay. So how worried should we be about all of this, and what should we do about it? It's like not a day goes by that I don't have this moment where I'm like, oh my gosh, I just cannot believe, I never thought I would see this. I didn't realize the country I was living in. And I had a moment like that just last night when Barack Obama, I think really courageously, justifiably, absolutely rightly identified the response to the protests as injustice and brutality at the hands of the state. So I have the quote for you here, but like a really powerful denunciation coming from a somewhat moderate but democratic politician. I think that is really important. I think that's really important. And just one final thought. So every now and then I do think it's appropriate to make a parallel to Weimar. One of the reasons that Germany's democracy collapsed was that the German democratic left fell apart. Germans who wanted a democracy and who were opposed to Hitler could not convince left of center voters that they shouldn't start voting for the Communist Party. There was a far left Stalinist party that ran in elections against Hitler all through the, the 20s into the 30s. And in the very end game, they were getting something like 20% of the national vote, because a lot of left of center people were like, you know what? Basically, the Democrats aren't doing anything for us. They're not addressing the problems in our lives. We're going to start voting for a radical left party that advocates revolution, because like no one's helping us here. So I think it is really, really, really important for moderate left of center Democratic forces to like respond to the very justifiable grievances of all of the people who are protesting, right? So the murder of innocent African Americans systemically in our country is a huge problem, and it's really important that people who are in favor of democracy take those concerns on and do something about them. One thing that really heartens me is that we have not seen a really strong anti-democratic left yet on the scene, but I also do worry that especially like young left of center people have kind of despaired over the democratic system, and I do think that's the thing to watch out for. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Marhoefer, and thanks to all our panelists for very, very interesting remarks that intersect, I think, really nicely and give us important perspectives on recent events and on the general theme of executive use of power and the vulnerabilities of the our democratic system. So one of the members of the audience submitted this question. How is the US government prepared to handle a scenario in which a sitting US president refuses to accept defeat in an election and leave office? So I was wondering if any of the panelists have any thoughts on that.
I'd be happy to talk a little bit about the legal structures that respond to that question. So basically, when you have a presidential election, it's pretty complicated from a legal perspective in terms of how it works. And you might think of there being sort of three major points after election day that help to determine what happens in a presidential election. So first, each of the states certifies its election results, and which is to say that the votes are counted after they're being cast either before or on election day. The state counts them all up, and then the state decides which person won the election, which in the case of the presidential election is actually not one presidential candidate or the other. It is instead electors. So that's sort of the first stage, is the states figuring that out. The second stage is that the electors who have been elected from the states come together and form the Electoral College. At that point, the Electoral College votes on who is actually going to be the president. So that's sort of the second stage. And then the third stage is the actual transfer of power. So when it comes to disputes associated with each of those three stages, I'll quickly sort of tell you the role that the president plays. And to give you a sort of top-down answer to that, the president plays basically no role as a legal matter. The president himself plays no role in any of these stages. But a bunch of other people do play important roles, and it's possible for the president to sort of lean on some of those people from a political matter. But from a legal matter, the president doesn't play a role. So with respect to that first stage, disputes coming out of the states are in charge of that. Okay, and the state legislatures ultimately are in charge of that. The president plays no role at that stage. Next, disputes over the Electoral College. Say that say that coming out of a state like Pennsylvania, there are two competing slates of electors that are purporting to cast votes. Somebody has to figure out which slate of electors is the one whose votes are going to count. The entity that's in charge of that is Congress. Again, it's not the president. Now, the vice president sits sort of the person who's sort of in charge during the sort of joint session of Congress, and there's some legal controversy over what role exactly the vice president plays there. But again, it's not the president who's playing any formal role at that stage. Finally, when it comes to the day that there's actually the transfer of power or the the president has been reelected and stays in power, which is January 20th of 2021 this year, again, the president plays no role. And in fact, if, say, for example, the elections were not to occur, or for some reason no individual were to get enough electoral college votes in order to have a president elected at that point, it actually, the Constitution indicates that the sitting president's term just automatically ends at that point. And then there's a succession in terms of who replaces the president. And that's a complicated from a legal perspective, but essentially that's going to drop down to, one of the members of Congress probably would become sort of the acting president at that point. So this is a lot of detail, but again, the punchline here is that the president plays no legal role in resolving a presidential election that's disputed. Now, I said that the states and state legislatures do play a role. I said that Congress does play a role. And that's just a reminder that if the president is able as a political matter to exert enough influence over these other actors, it may be possible for him to move things around a bit.
Okay, thank you very much. So there are a few questions that have come in about the use of federal troops in Portland or similar federal entities. One question is this, what federal security services appear to be particularly receptive to being deployed in the crushing of dissent?
I would just, I think my fellow panelists are better qualified to answer this, but I would say one really positive thing that came out of the Lafayette Square protests was that, or the Lafayette Square moment, was that in the wake of it, a lot of military chiefs really spoke out. And I thought that was an extremely promising sign that the armed forces are not susceptible. And that, I mean, that's really, and that's key, and it's tremendous. And it's not a huge surprise. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that as a promising sign.
Thank you.
I think another, I would agree with that. I think that's important to recognize that. I think another dynamic that's going on that again is a sort of product of recent political history is the large, there are many actors here. So not only are there many different agencies and sub-agencies, but we also have a lot of contractors and different levels of, as well as sort of federalism itself and different levels of government. So I think there are a couple of dynamics that are at work and certainly have been on display in the recent months in Seattle and elsewhere, which is one is just the increasing militarization of local police forces, which is both in terms of tactics and in equipment is kind of an offshoot of the growth of American counterinsurgency missions abroad, the larger growth of the military, particularly since 9/11, this secure sort of national security, domestic homeland security dimension that has extended down to the local level, and also it is also part and parcel of this larger expansion of policing and of crime and punishment since the 1990s. So it sort of has these multiple fathers, so to speak, but we kind of end up with heavily armed police, and also where you have local law enforcement that looks like they're military. So there's also this kind of presentation. But there's also the kind of the public-private divide has shifted, and the U.S. government at all levels over the last 40 years has outsourced more and more things to the private sector. So there are a lot of things, and particularly things in the kind of the broader military realm, less in kind of overseas operations. We don't see this with the troops on the front lines, but we see this with all of the support services, for example, and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and other military, sort of U.S. military presence abroad. It is a big business, and a lot of the personnel are kind of occupying this interesting liminal space. In a way, there's this kind of gray area between a standing army and armed Americans that is somewhat, recalls the earliest days of the war, the Revolutionary War itself, in the earliest days of the Republic, when these boundaries are being drawn. So I think the other thing that this is complicating all of this, and the question of kind of whose side are the troops, who are the troops and whose side are they on? And the thing about the military chain of command is that you have a kind of you have a chain of command. So if you have someone at the top of the food chain who's saying this was a bad idea or stopping something from happening, there's a hierarchy, there's command there where it isn't as clear in these other instances.
Thank you very much. So one of the undergraduates who registered for the event today submitted a question that goes like this. I was wondering how the size of the United States, and especially the wide range of socio-political attitudes within our states, impacts the spread and shape of authoritarian policy, action, and violence in America. This country has a long history of conflict between the laws of states and the laws of the larger government. And this person is curious as to how this tension would inform American authoritarianism. And even though the question focuses on the United States, the opportunity for us to bring in Professor Marhoefer's comparative expertise here is implicit in the question.
That's a great question. Our undergrads are so smart. We're so lucky. I mean, does anyone else want to try?
Well, sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah, I don't, I think also what we have going on is like the digital revolution as part of this. So it's possible even more so to be part of an intellectual community through your computer that it wasn't possible in the same way, 30 years ago. I mean, certainly, yeah. So the kinds of polarization that we're seeing is almost independent of geography.
So I agree with that. And I think that also goes in many different directions, right? So there's an opportunity for example, people who are interested in democracy to find each other, and then also people who are seeking to undermine it as well. So it kind of cuts both directions. One thing that I thought of in response to that question actually relates to sanctuary cities or sanctuary jurisdictions. And what these are as a legal matter is these are, for example, Seattle, the state of California, et cetera. These are places where the government has decided that it is unwilling to cooperate with federal authorities when it comes to certain federal immigration policies. As a legal matter, it is totally legal, it is fully constitutional for state and local jurisdictions to do this. Now, because just to be precise, there's certain things that jurisdictions can do that perhaps would violate federal law, but the basic idea that the local or the state jurisdictions are saying, we refuse to help you, affirmatively help you with your federal policies, that is fully constitutional. The Supreme Court has been very clear on that. And this then leads to the question, why does it matter so much? Why doesn't the federal government just do this work itself? And the answer is that the federal government in our country can't do the work itself. It doesn't have enough people. The federal government is enormous. There's millions of people working for the federal government, but they actually do, as a logistical matter, they need the assistance of state and local governments in order to effectuate really sweeping sort of law enforcement policies like this. So to the extent that the person who asked this is sort of wondering, is there something about our federalist structure that actually makes it harder for, the federal government and specifically for a president to start really taking everything over? The answer is absolutely. It does make it a lot harder. And it's also for anybody who sort of feels like he or she wants to sort of have something to contribute here, but sort of feels like Washington, D.C. is far away. I would remind you that the policies that a jurisdiction like Seattle has, it matters. Matters for the people in Seattle, and that has ripple effects elsewhere as well.
Yeah, I would add, and I think that there have been so many examples in this year of who your local and state officials are matter, right? Thinking about the varying responses to the COVID pandemic and how that has, directly affected human health. I think this question points to this tension that runs throughout American history, which is, look, this is a country that was created based on overthrowing monarchy and, hereditary rule. We don't like bigness, or there's been this kind of dislike. The Jeffersonian dislike of bigness has often triumphed over the Hamiltonian desire to centralize. And that tension runs through. It runs through, and this question of states' rights versus, and now we have this really interesting flip that's going on in terms of state and local rights or states' rights versus federal rights in the Trump era, as opposed to, say, the civil rights era, when you had Dwight Eisenhower and Kennedy and presidents kind of the federal government exercising its authority and sometimes using its military powers to do so over southern states who were saying this is an infringement of our constitutional liberties. And now we have the governor of Oregon and the mayor of Portland, and we have the mayor of Seattle and the governor of Washington, and we have this now battle. Again, it often boils down on partisan lines, but it is this question of this, even though there are so many things that connect us now, this is still a place that has a country that has sectional fractures, and those fractures, those fault lines are not necessarily the same geographically as they always have been, and they've changed over time, but there is a very, very different, we have an extraordinarily divided country on so many metrics. And again, I think in the wake of COVID, we're seeing those divisions kind of split open and widen. And one thing that I'm just I guess shouldn't be surprised by, but still remain stunned, is the degree to which COVID has devastated some parts of the economy and the people who are part of it, and has left others, if not unscathed, quite in few places prosperity. Apple has doubled its market cap in the last 21 weeks, I think, and it's just stunning how things are divided and different, and we can understand why this is. But I think to Lisa's point, it does, these differences do make it harder, and they were designed, federalism was designed to prevent another King George. So, this is, we in some ways are living with that legacy today.
Thank you. Some of the questions that came in before the event had to do implicitly with trying to define the Trumpist ideology that is the defining feature of many of the attempts to push the boundaries of legality and practice. One person asked whether this is fascism. Professor Marhoefer, in her remarks, cautioned us from making too many direct comparisons between the current moment and, say, 1929 to 1933 in Weimar Germany. But I think this question of ideology and political culture and political thought has been on people's minds as we grapple with, on a day-to-day basis, these transgressions of what many of us have regarded as unimpeachable norms and practice and law. So I was wondering if the three panelists could talk a little bit about ideology, big ideas behind some of the seemingly disparate and contradictory actions that we've seen in the exercise of executive power.
I'm not sure if I can speak to the sort of the big ideas or I've read some books about fascism, but it's not, this is sort of like I started with talking about, this is sort of not, we're outside the realm of the legal now. But what I can say from a legal perspective that may be responsive to this a little bit is that if, to the extent that anybody's watching what's going on and seeing the president do things that feel like they're things a president shouldn't be doing, you might think about them as sort of falling into three categories. One is that there are norms in place, which is to say there's just sort of practices and understandings about what's okay to do and what's not okay to do. And it's actually nothing that's written down. It's nothing that in law. It's not illegal to do some of these things, but it just feels, it feels like the president is taking another step forward. President Trump has been doing this since he was running for election. I mean, this is sort of his MO. Then the second category I would say are laws that are broken where there's no real effective enforcement mechanism for them. And a lot of those relate to, for example, foreign affairs. So there's rules, there's statutes that govern how presidents can use force against hostile powers. President Trump has, on at least one occasion, he has employed force abroad in a way that violated those statutes. Now, of course, President Obama arguably did the same thing there. So and I'm not going to try to equate the two. They're not the same, the two presidents, but it is just a reminder that there are some things where the law exists, but there's no way for there to really be an enforcement mechanism there, and so there's some slippage there over time. And again, President Trump is violating a lot of those sorts of laws too, where there's no effective enforcement mechanism. Then finally, there are breaking laws where there is an effective enforcement mechanism, and that's what we keep seeing coming out of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court keeps saying things like, no, you can't do this, yes, you have to do that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And here's the thing, I don't think have seen the federal government under President Trump violate a clear Supreme Court case telling the government it has to do something or that it can't do something else. So when it comes to that third category, we have not seen a breakdown of that at this point. That part of the rule of law, as far as I can tell, is still holding. And to the extent that anyone wants to say, yes, but what about the president has, or the administration has failed to implement DACA again the way it should have, or the administration took this step after that or this. There's all these arguments sort of on the margin that maybe the government has not been sort of completely compliant. But here's the thing, the government is still purporting to follow the Supreme Court's precedents. It's still purporting to follow the law in these regards. And to me, that's very, very, very important, because as long as that holds, then the rule of law at least one level is holding, even in these areas if it's not holding, where there's no enforcement mechanism, and even when the norms are being broken down. So again, I don't know if that's responsive, but that's sort of what I think when I think about these big picture issues.
Thank you very much. Maybe some of our other two panelists have thoughts on this.
Yeah, so so there's been this ongoing conversation amongst historians who study Weimar and Nazi Germany about whether or not this is fascism or a kind of neo-fascism. And the vast majority of us don't think it is fascism or neo-fascism, but it's kind of an academic debate, because what we mean by fascism, I don't think is what a lot of, like in the general world, fascism means a right of center authoritarianism that's scary. And I mean, there is authoritarianism here, it's right of center, and it is scary. So I absolutely understand why that word is coming up for people. Fascism in the first half of the 20th century iteration was really a collectivist idea that was about subverting or destroying the individual and focusing on the collective. And this Trumpism is really a liberal ideology. The individual is super important. And even though there's racism through both of them, I just see that barrier as insurmountable. But again, I don't know how helpful that is when Germanists are like, it's not technically fascism. But yeah, another thing that I think is really important that defines Trumpism is like the absurdism or the departure from rationality or the fantasy stuff that becomes part of it. And that also was really characteristic of fascism. Not that I think it means Trump is a fascist, but it's interesting to see these. I think you also see it in far left ideology as well, but the use of fantasy in a really effective way to marshal your supporters. Authoritarians are like, we think of them just making rules and everybody follows, but they're always running for office. They need a big block of popular supporters. That's super important. No state is so powerful that it can suppress all dissent. So how they cultivate their supporters is really important, and that also can be disrupted democratically and peacefully.
Thank you.
Well, what we're going through here this year is sort of a continuation of an ongoing conversation that's been going on since 1789, if not before, which is, what is American? What is Americanism? What's un-American? What is patriotism? and two, different, two sides making a case that Trumpism and the president and the administration and his allies see kind of threats to American sovereignty, threats to the kind of the country as it is, whereas his opponents and the resistance to Trumpism also sees the great threat. And I think running through this is also that the American democracy is imperfect and America has never lived up to the democracy that it professed, and particularly to the mythos it projected of egalitarianism and equality, and the definition of what is Americanism and who is American and who gets to claim patriotism is one that remains contested. What I'm heartened by is I've been heartened by the very, very American tradition of protest that has continued in this year. Protest on the streets and protest that's played out in so many other ways. And this kind of reinvigoration of the body politic. And, I'm a Gen Xer. I've spent now, 3 decades of people being cynical about politics. I was there in 2000 when everyone was like, George W. Bush, Al Gore, there's no difference. I'm voting for Ralph Nader. I think that we've discovered, both Democrats and Republicans discovered, that was a real difference between those two trajectories since. So I see this kind of, and I welcome kind of the earnest engagement, and historians see the power that comes in protest and the power of articulating and claiming American democracy and redefining it. It is always dynamic. And so let's take heart from what we have seen, as well as be very watchful and cautious about extensions of power beyond where they should go.
Well, I think that optimistic note is a really good one to end on. And I would like to thank our 3 panelists, Professor Lisa Manheim, Professor Margaret O'Mara, and Professor Laurie Marhoefer for their really insightful remarks today. And I would like to thank our audience for your presence and participation. And again, end by thanking Alexandra Colley, who did so much to make this event possible. Thank you so much. And again, may you vote, put it that way, to end it. Bye.
Everyone vote.